I'm Tiberius Stormwind from Draconia. And moreover, Vox Machina over at Greyskull.
There are some stories in tabletop games that linger, not just because of what happened, but because of how they ended, because of what's left behind. Tiberius Stormwind was one of the founding members of Vox Machina, a red dragonborn sorcerer from Draconia. He was loud, loyal, ambitious, and endlessly curious. He helped shape the early days of Critical Role's first campaign, bringing explosive magic, a flair for theatrics, and a big-hearted presence to the table. And then he left. Tiberius's departure was sudden. It happened both in the world of the story and in the real world behind the scenes. And like any story that ends abruptly, it left space. Space for questions, space for reflection, and space, eventually, for closure. This video isn't about explaining everything that happened, because honestly, not everything needs to be explained. Instead, it's about honouring the story we were given and thinking through the legacy that Tiberius left behind. It's about looking at how the world of Vox Machina carried on after he left, how the cast handled it with care, and what we can learn from a story that had to shift and grow without one of its earliest voices. We'll be focusing mainly on the in-world impact of Tiberius's departure, his arc, his absence, and how the party found a way to say goodbye, but we will also take a moment to acknowledge the real-world context, gently and respectfully, without excusing or defending what happened. Because part of being in a community like this one is learning how to hold space for difficult truths. So let's revisit Tiberius Stormwind, not to rewrite his story, but to reflect on what it meant, what it changed, and what it left behind. Before everything changed, before dragons and gods and the weight of the world, there was Tiberius Stormwind. He was one of the very first characters to sit at the heart of Vox Machina. A red dragonborn sorcerer from Draconia, born into status and magical talent, but far more interested in books and artifacts than in titles or tradition. Tiberius didn't just cast spells, he carried a sense of wonder. The world was wide, full of secrets and danger, and he wanted to experience all of it. In the early days of Critical Role, Tiberius was one of the loudest voices at the table. He had a flair for the theatrical, big gestures, booming declarations, a fondness for strange plans and stranger inventions. But beneath all that was a character who really cared about people, about doing something meaningful with his life. That's what set him apart. He wasn't just a walking spellbook, he was someone trying in his own chaotic way to make the world better. He offered levity in serious moments, magic in desperate ones, and curiosity in between. And while not every plan worked, he was always trying, always pushing forward. And that mattered because in those early sessions, when the world of Exandria was still unfolding and the cast was still finding their rhythm, Tiberius helped set the tone. He made space for big emotion and bigger ideas. For a while, it felt like he might be with Vox Machina forever, but as we know, that's not how the story played out.
And I've learned much, and for that I thank you sincerely. However, my diplomatic mission has fallen to the wayside these recent months, and while my personal mission to recover these artifacts has grown stagnant. As proven by my time in Draconia, I have still yet to gain the respect of my family. And I feel that the path of Vox Machina and the path of Tiberius Stormwind haven't been aligned for some time.
When a character leaves the story, especially one as closely connected to the heart of a group as Tiberius was, it leaves a ripple. And in the case of Vox Machina, that ripple felt more like a quiet wave that none of them were quite ready for. Tiberius didn't go out in a blaze of glory. There wasn't a climactic battle or dramatic fallout. Instead, he stepped away slowly, at first leaving temporarily to follow a lead, and then, with little fanfare, choosing not to return. In world, the party was caught off guard. Tiberius told them that his path no longer aligned with theirs, that he had work to do elsewhere, that he believed it was time to go, and then he left. There's something about that kind of goodbye that sticks with you. It's not neat, it's not tidy, it doesn't wrap things up with a pretty bow. It leaves questions hanging. What changed? Did he really mean to walk away forever? Was there something left unsaid? You can see the impact in the way the others react. There's a quiet tension around the table. Some try to accept it gracefully, others seem unsure what to say. There's love in their voices, but there's grief too, because a friend they thought they'd fight beside for years to come just wasn't there anymore. And for us, as viewers, it was just as sudden. One day, Tiberius was there, casting spells and shaping the world with his wild ideas, and the next, he wasn't. And we didn't know if or how the story would address it. But that's what's powerful about that moment. Messy as it was, it felt real. Because sometimes in life and in stories, people leave. Not with drama, but with distance. And that loss, that absence, can echo louder than any final word. The party carried on. They had to, but they did so with a quiet weight in their steps because something was missing. And for a while, no one quite knew how to talk about it.
I encourage violence.
Tiberius left quietly, but the silence he left behind carried weight. For a while, his absence was just that, an absence. Vox Machina didn't speak of it often. The story kept moving, new challenges arose, new bonds formed. But the gap was still there, lingering in the background, like a book left unfinished. And when someone matters, that kind of silence doesn't stay quiet forever. Eventually, the story caught up to the absence, and when it did, it came in the form of a discovery. Far from the places they'd last seen him, the party came across signs of a battle, a body, a red-scaled hand. And in that moment, it became real. Tiberius Stormwind had died, off-screen, alone. There's something uniquely painful about that. A friend gone with no last words, no final moment to make peace or say goodbye. Just a quiet ending, frozen in time. But what followed was something that mattered just as much as any farewell. Remembrance. Vox Machina didn't just gloss over the moment. They stopped. They grieved. They buried him beneath the skies of Draconia, and eventually they commissioned a statue. And through those acts, they gave us something rare, a story that allowed space for closure even without resolution. And on that statue, they had a message carved. I encourage peace. It's a striking phrase, not because it perfectly captured who Tiberius was, but because it didn't. More often than not, he was brash, chaotic, and unpredictable. Peace was rarely what he brought to a room, but that line wasn't really about him. Not entirely. It was a message to the people left behind, to the survivors of a fractured homeland, and perhaps to us. Because in that moment, Vox Machina were not just burying a character. The cast of Critical Role were also closing a chapter. And rather than confront the real-world context directly, rather than reignite division, they chose to respond with something quiet, something kind. I encourage peace was a way of saying we're moving forward. We're choosing to let this ending be what it is without bitterness. We're offering memory, not erasure, and peace, not conflict. It wasn't about rewriting history, it was about framing it, about finding a way to say goodbye that didn't invite more pain or confusion or speculation. And in doing so, they gave us, quietly and gently, a model for how to hold complicated stories, with compassion and with care. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say after a fracture isn't a justification, it's a hope.
Unfortunately, Ryan Akaba is no longer with Critical Role going forward.
It's impossible to talk about Tiberius Stormwind without acknowledging the other half of the story. the part that lives outside the world of Exandria. In 2015, the Critical Role team quietly announced that Ryan Akaba, who played Tiberius, would no longer be part of the show. The message was short, respectful, and deliberately free of detail. It simply said that the cast would continue forward and that Orion remained a friend. Over time, more came to light about behaviour behind the scenes, about interpersonal dynamics, about things that were not okay. And it's important to say clearly the concerns raised about Orion were real and they mattered. This video isn't here to litigate those details. Others have done that and done it thoroughly. Instead, what's worth paying attention to, especially from a storytelling perspective, is how the cast chose to respond. Not with drama, not with condemnation, but with distance, with dignity, and with care. They didn't pretend Tiberius never existed. They didn't recast him, they didn't erase him. They let his absence become part of the world, and over time, they gave that absence space. They let it become grief, and eventually they let it become memory. That choice, so quiet, so intentional, is part of what makes Critical Role feel human. It's a reminder that stories can hold uncomfortable truths without collapsing under them, that you can move forward without pretending the past didn't happen, and that sometimes kindness means closing the door gently, even when things didn't end the way you hoped they would. What the cast offered in the end was a kind of grace, and through that they gave us permission to carry the good, even when we can't ignore the difficult.
Could you build a statue, a fine statue, a handsome statue of Tiberius Stormwind and bury him underneath it? And on the pedestal, could you please write, "I encourage peace"?
Legacy is a complicated thing, especially when a story ends before we expect it. And yet, Tiberius Stormwind left one. Not just in the mechanics of a campaign or in the moments he was a part of, but in something quieter, something that stuck. He was one of the original voices that gave Vox Machina its shape. That blend of chaos, of sincerity, and of flawed brilliance and theatrical charm, Tiberius helped set the tone for what Critical Role would become. He showed that characters could be messy, that they could be larger than life and still carry real emotion, that even in a story filled with epic quests and ancient gods, there was still space for levity, for ambition, and for hearts that didn't always know what they were doing, but tried anyway. And even after he left, the story remembered him through a statue in Draconia, through a grave tended with care, through a single line, "I encourage peace," echoing in a place torn by war. He became something more than his actions. He became a symbol, not just to the people of Draconia, but to Vox Machina and to us. Because whether or not Tiberius was always easy or perfect or even safe, he mattered, and the cast made space for that. They chose to let his legacy be felt, not just as a player who once sat at the table, but as a character whose absence meant something, as someone who shaped the people who remained. And that's what legacy is at its core. Not just what you did, but what changed because of you. Tiberius' story ended early, but it left a mark. And for many of us, that mark is still worth remembering. Stories don't always end the way we expect them to, and when they don't, when something ends early or strangely or imperfectly, we're left with the harder task, figuring out what to take from it, what to carry forward. Tiberius's arc, both on and off the screen, reminds us that even in shared storytelling, things can change suddenly. People may leave, chapters may close before they feel finished, and when that happens, what matters most is how we respond. Vox Machina could have pretended that nothing happened. The cast could have rewritten the past or glossed it over, but instead, They chose to hold the space. They left room for grief. They let the memory of a flawed friend become something human, something the story could honor, even without perfect resolution. And in doing so, they reminded us that legacy is an act of choice, that we decide what to preserve and how to move forward, not by denying the difficult parts, but by holding them alongside the good, by making space for complexity and choosing compassion anyway. There's also something to be said for how gently the cast treated their audience during that time. They didn't speak in anger, they didn't fuel speculation, they simply showed through the story itself what closure could look like when kindness leads the way. It wasn't about erasing what came before, it was about acknowledging it and letting it rest. As players, as storytellers, as fans, there is something powerful in that. We're reminded that not all goodbyes are clean, that sometimes letting go is hard, but when we do it with grace, we leave the door open for healing, for honouring, and for peace. Because sometimes that's the most courageous thing a story can do. Not tie everything up neatly, but carry on with empathy. Tiberius Stormwind's story didn't end in the way anyone expected, but in many ways that's what made it real. It was messy, sudden and unresolved, but it was also deeply human. And in the way his friends remembered him, in the way the cast let his absence echo rather than vanish, there was something powerful, something honest. Tiberius left a mark on Vox Machina, on the world of Exandria, on us. And whether you loved him or struggled with him or simply remember him faintly, his story still matters. Not because it was perfect, but because it was part of the beginning, and because even imperfect stories deserve to be held with care. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you take away from how Tiberius' story was handled? If this video resonated with you, please join the Discord, link in the description below, and whilst you're down there, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more deep dives like this. And until next time, may we all strive to carry difficult stories with honesty, kindness, and grace.